Good evening and welcome to the Naval Units Comparison Chart. This video is going to compare each faction's naval units across the different tech levels. It's going to contain lots of tips about naval units. And if you're asking yourself, when is your faction's navy strong and when is it weak, this chart is going to have the answer. If you're undecided about which faction to play, this video is going to help you choose. And if you find this interesting, please also check out my other comparison charts. The link to them is in the video description below. This chart is going to be subjective, and it is going to reflect my own experience, not a general truth. So feel welcome to make your own comparison chart if your opinions deviate. My experience about a T3 Navy is limited because I don't typically play Setons. That's why I interviewed Giebmasse and Yudi about T3 naval gameplay. Thank you very much for helping out making this chart, Giebmasse and Yudi. And I suggest we get started. Let's get started by talking about frigates. So please take a look at the axis down here. It says T1, it says T2 and T1 frigates, and it says T3 and T1 frigates. This axis is not only meant to distinguish the different tech levels in this chart, but it's also meant to serve as a reminder that you spam frigates across all tech levels in the game. Frigates are your backbone of your navy. They contribute a lot of firepower, they are tanky, and they can swarm high-value ships easily. Don't even think about skipping T1 Navy. So if you try to get a fast T2 naval factory supported by engineers, and you think that you can get out your first destroyer or submarine before the enemy is going to swarm you with frigates, this is not going to work. Frigate spam always beats T1 skip, even on 20 × 20 kilometer maps. And by spam, I mean 10 and more naval factories constantly producing frigates. This is entirely realistic on maps like Whitefire, Roanoke, and Seraphim Glaciers. So this is how important frigates are. Frigates are going to be 90% and more of your naval composition at all times on most maps. What types of frigates are there? Well, there are alpha damage frigates for Aeon and UEF, which fire strong but few projectiles. And there are damage over time frigates for Siren and Seraphim, which fire frequent but individually weak projectiles. So which of the two is better? Alpha damage or damage over time on your frigate? Well, alpha damage tends to overkill. So let's say you have a wounded engineer that is going to die in the next shot. You can either take the shot of an Aeon frigate to kill it, which takes 4 seconds to reload, and most of the damage is going to be wasted, or you use a rapid fire frigate for Siren, for example, that can kill the engineer very fast and immediately switch over to the next target. Also, think about dodging. Is it easier to dodge bullet rain or one shot every 4 seconds? Of course, it's going to be easier to dodge just one shot every 4 seconds. So these are two situations in which the damage over time frigate outperforms the Alpha Strike frigate. There's just one situation in which the Alpha Strike frigate is better than the damage over time frigate, and that is when you expect the battle to be very short. So for example, you outnumber your opponent completely, you are performing hit and run tactics, or you are outnumbered by your opponent. Then the battle is going to be so short that having one very strong shot is much better than inflicting damage over time. But these situations happen rather rarely because typically battles are going to be balanced and even numbers. So all in all, the Alpha Strike frigate is going to be outperformed by the damage over time frigate. The frigates also differ in range. All non-Aeon frigates have a gun range of 28 and the Aeon frigate has a gun range of 31. This +3 range advantage for the Aeon frigate is not very notable in naval-to-naval combat though, because battles between frigates typically take a long time and the opponent has a lot of time to react whenever they notice that you are shooting at them but they are not shooting back at you. Kiting with the Aeon frigate is quite difficult because it can't shoot its own bridge, so you have to broadside and then you can't really run away. So this range difference of 3 is really relevant only on some maps with coast mass extractors you want to raid, and non-Aeon frigates won't reach it, but the Aeon frigate will. This is true for some mass extractors on Roanoke, for example. This small range advantage of the Aeon frigate comes at quite the high price though. because all non-Aeon frigates have onboard anti-air, and only the Aeon frigate does not have it. This onboard anti-air is extremely practical because it grants extra survivability to the Navy, and even though the anti-air is individually quite weak, it adds up with increasing fleet size, and each frigate has a long lifetime because of its tankiness, and then it has the potential to deal a lot of damage to aircraft over its lifetime. Not having onboard anti-air on the frigate is really a disadvantage for the Aeon Navy, and their Shard anti-air boat is not really making up for it. Because even though the Shard is quite a good unit against T1 air, it has high micro potential, it can dodge a lot. The Aeon player is forced to spend extra eco on a boat that does not add any firepower against Navy. And last, to evaluate T1 frigates, we just have to take a look at cost, HP, and DPS. And we realized that Aeon has lower HP and higher cost than other frigates, and Submarine has lower cost and higher DPS than other frigates. And this allows us to rank the frigates. So Submarine is by far the best frigate, followed by UEF and Seraphim, and Aeon is by far the worst frigate in the game. Now let's take a look at T1 submarines. They are either tanky or they aren't, and they either have a deck laser or they don't. Aeon, Submarine, and UEF are tanky submarines compared to the weak Seraphim submarine. The Seraphim submarine has torpedo defense instead, but this torpedo defense has a slow fire cycle, and you can pretty much almost ignore it. It is super useless. So it definitely does not compensate for this lower HP. And about deck laser, well, if the submarine emerges, it can target hover engineers. This is the main purpose of the deck laser. And the Submarine and the UEF and the Seraphim submarine come with a deck laser, but the Aeon does not. So the Aeon submarine is not going to be able to shoot at hover engineers that aren't connected to the water. The last couple of units we need to talk about in the T1 category are the Aeon Hover Tank, the Aeon Hover Scout, and the Seraphim Hover Arty. The Aeon Hover Tank is a great raid unit in the first couple of minutes game time on a small naval map, but as soon as your opponent has the first frigate out, you should stop relying on hover tanks. Do not try to outspam enemy frigate production with your own Aurora production. You're going to burn a lot of resources, and you will just end up donating mass and veterancy to the enemy. So don't do it. If you use Aurora to raid early on, bring a scout so that they can fire at their maximum range and you provide vision to them. And land scouts are not only useful for their radar function for hover tanks, but they also work as a standalone scout unit. So on some maps, you may be able to scout your opponent with a hover land scout before your air scout could arrive. That gives you speed advantage, and situationally, it could also generate an economic advantage if you can delay your air scout and instead rely on land scout. So on some maps like Whitefire and Eye of the Storm, going for a land scout opening works out. Now, Seraphim Hover Arty is also a great early raid unit, but of course in small scale battles it's going to lose against Aurora because the Aurora can just dodge the Arty projectiles and the Arty won't have any chance at killing the Aurora. But the Seraphim Hover Arty has other advantages. So let's say you play against Aeon, you lose Navy, and you try to stall the enemy naval player so that they cannot capitalize on their naval victory as fast. And then if you do large-scale Hover Arty spam, the enemy ships may be forced to kite back a little bit, and it takes more time, and the opponent will have to make more frigates in order to actually block the coast entirely and start bombarding your base from there. So Aeon Navy is generally going to struggle against any kind of hover, and this also applies to Seraphim Hover Arty spam. If we now take a look at T1 Navy as a whole and we try to rank the factions by the relative power of the T1 Navy, we would put Submarine first because their frigate is inexpensive, strong, it has a rapid fire cycle, and it comes with onboard anti-air. This is probably followed by UEF, whose frigate is tanky. It also has onboard anti-air, and it has some jamming, which may make it difficult at times to tell the exact position and number of enemy frigates. The Seraphim frigate is also very solid. It has a rapid fire cycle. It comes with onboard anti-air, but the drawback of the Seraphim Navy is perhaps that the submarine is going to lose against the submarines of their peers. Aeon Navy is dead last because the frigate is just comparably bad, and Aeon is always going to have a hard time against hover because of the lack of a good frigate. The Aeon submarine is okay, but it does not have a deck laser, so it is worse at killing enemy engineers. And the anti-air ship is rather a drawback than a merit of the Aeon T1 Navy. So that's your ranking. Let us move on to T2 Navy, and we first talk about the most important T2 naval unit for any faction, which is always the destroyer. Some of you, when you hit T2 Navy, are going to open with the cruiser because you think that the destroyer and the cruiser are essentially the same unit, except the cruiser comes with good anti-air weaponry on top of what the destroyer already has. Get this idea out of your head, this is wrong. And some of you are just going to open with T2 submarines and they're just going to keep spamming T2 submarines for the rest of the game, and this is how you play T2 Navy. Well, this does not work either. So if your opponent is going to open with a destroyer and you're stuck with a cruiser or you're stuck with submarines, then your opponent is most likely going to win. So please do not fall for this support unit trap. Instead, keep in mind that the destroyer is the most important unit for any faction in the T2 naval stage. If we try to rank the destroyers, the first question we ask ourselves is about range. Of course, long range is better than short range, and we observe that Aeon and Submarine have long range destroyers, but UEF and Seraphim have short range destroyers. The next question we are going to ask ourselves is about damage type. We know that damage over time is typically better than alpha damage, and we observe damage over time on the Submarine destroyer and alpha damage on the Aeon, UEF and Seraphim destroyer. The Seraphim destroyer is a little bit of an exception though. It has a slow fire cycle, but it is using beam weapons, so they tend not to miss and they tend not to overkill as much. For this reason, alpha damage on the Seraphim destroyer is not as bad actually. Damage type is also about whether most of the damage is surface based, coming from deck cannons, or whether this is a hybrid between deck cannon damage and underwater weaponry damage. Typically, hybrids are better, and we observe that Aeon, Submarine and Seraphim are hybrids, but UEF is mostly deck cannon damage based. So it is going to need support from Coopers to handle enemy submarines well. This information is already a good foundation based on which you can try to rank the destroyers. Let's combine this information with additional observations from gameplay and come up with our ranking. The Submarine destroyer doesn't overkill a lot. Dodge micro is not particularly great against it because of its fast fire cycle. Some projectiles are just going to hit even if you try to dodge. And the Submarine destroyer, of course, can walk on land. And this probably makes it the best destroyer in the game. The Aeon destroyer is good if you kite, and it is very good against submarines too. It is equipped with depth charges, and these are strong, dedicated anti-submarine weapons. But the Aeon destroyer is going to struggle against hover spam because of the slow fire cycle. The Seraphim destroyer is overall solid, and it is very good against hover spam because of the laser weapon. It can submerge, and this is also a huge advantage, especially against UEF, and because it can dive under the dome of a shield boat, then emerge to laser the Cooper and the shield boat, and then submerge again to avoid most of the damage from the enemy destroyer, but still inflict own torpedo damage. The UEF destroyer is not very good against. So whether the Aeon destroyer or the Seraphim destroyer are better is probably going to come down to micro and individual preferences. But it is without question that UEF has the worst destroyer in the game, because this one is going to die against submarines since it doesn't have a lot of torpedo weaponry. The projectiles can be dodged, and it lacks the range to make good use of its alpha damage. Moving on to support weapons, let's talk about cruisers. Cruisers are primarily anti-air ships, but these perform differently across factions. Imagine you could design your own cruiser for the purpose of killing aircraft. What would it be like? Well, ideally, you would choose an anti-air weapon with a fast projectile speed. This way, your cruiser can run away from incoming aircraft and kill some of them before they even arrive to deal damage to your cruiser. And ideally, you would place your cruiser into a context where your hover land units or your navy has access to support units that can inexpensively shield your cruiser and add more HP to make it more tanky. Knowing this, we can rank the different cruisers by their performance against aircraft. And we would place Aeon first because of its fast projectile speed and because Aeon players have access to the inexpensive T2 hover shield, the Asylum. This is followed by UEF because UEF players have access to the shield boat that can add HP to their cruisers. And next would be Seraphim. Seraphim don't really have an inexpensive way of shielding their cruiser because they would have to get T3 land to get hover shields. This is quite a big investment, so you don't commonly see it. You see it sometimes in team games, but not a lot. But it's not really a problem that the Seraphim cruiser is not going to be shielded most of the time, because Seraphim players can just spam hover Flak in addition to their cruisers. And then they just have more anti-air firepower, and if some of it dies, the rest is going to be able to kill the remaining aircraft. The Seraphim cruiser also comes with area of effect damage on its anti-air weapon, and so it is still a solid cruiser. That last would be Cybran, because the Cybran cruiser has a slow projectile speed, and there is no hover shield or shield boat to make up for it. All cruisers also have a second weapon. Aeon and Cybran have a direct fire deck gun, but no missile launcher. Both of these direct fire deck guns aren't great, but Cybran is somewhat useful against hover because of the fast fire cycle and comparably high DPS. The Aeon direct fire deck gun has a slower fire cycle and less DPS, so it is useful against very small amount of light hover at best. I don't recommend to use these cruisers against enemy navy in direct fire combat because your cruiser is too valuable and too vulnerable for that. The Seraphim and the UEF cruiser have a missile launcher on board which can be used for base bombardment. But the two missile launchers differ. So the Seraphim missile launcher is a bit more of a damage over time weapon. It is going to fire one missile every 2 seconds, and the fire cycle is going to evenly spread out the projectiles. The UEF cruiser is a little more of an alpha strike weapon because it is going to fire 4 missiles in quick succession, and then it's going to reload for 10 seconds. The Seraphim cruiser also has double the DPS on its missiles compared to the UEF cruiser. So, which of the two is better? Well, when there's no Team D around, then the Seraphim cruiser is certainly better at taking out bases fast. But when there is Team D around, then if you have multiple UEF cruisers and you synchronize their fire cycles a little, then you can overwhelm the Team D much easier. So in this case, it really depends on the situation, and there's no best practice solution for the best cruiser. But if it helps, the UEF cruiser also comes with a direct fire deck gun against light hover. A slightly different perspective. Is it a problem that the Aeon and the Cybran cruiser don't have a missile launcher? Well, for Cybran, not really, because Cybran destroyers can walk on land, and if you have fighters and Wakeners, you can still destroy the base at the coast even without a missile cruiser. Aeon, however, need a T3 missile ship for coast bombardment, so yes, for Aeon it is a problem, because Aeon requires a lot of time and resources to bombard a base after winning navy. The weakness against hover doesn't help. Speaking of hover, what can we say about T2 and T3 hover? Hover Flak is good because it can replace cruisers. Hover shields are nice for Aeon because they can shield cruisers, and for Seraphim they are primarily used to shield submarine hunters. What about hover tanks? Well, frigates are generally more efficient than hover tanks, and hover tanks are quite slow on the water. Hover tanks can be used to stall enemy navy after the own navy is lost, and this works most successfully against Aeon. About the individual tanks, well, Seraphim has a solid T2 hover tank, UEF has a good but also expensive T2 hover tank, and Aeon just has a bad T2 hover tank. The Cyber amphibious tank can travel underwater. This is useful sometimes, but I generally prefer a real hover tank instead. About T2 submarines, you build them to punish a UF player for not building Coopers, their torpedo boat. And you build them to stall Seraphim players who build submarine hunters. Some people open with T2 submarines when they hit T2 Navy and their opponent's not T2 Navy yet, because there are going to be lots of frigates the submarines can kill, but I don't generally recommend doing so because kiting destroyers are just as good against frigates, and they don't die as easily to torpedo bombers and enemy destroyers. About the individual units, the Barracuda, the Cyber submarine, is better than the Vesper, the Aeon submarine. And the UEF can use shield boats and Coopers to intercept incoming torpedoes and fire own torps quite effectively. Seraphim destroyers are fine against T2 submarines, and any torpedo bomber is going to slaughter submarines. So T2 submarines are not usually a big threat. Lastly, let us talk about the Mermaid, the T2 stealth boat for Cyber. This one is going to force your opponent to stream scouts over your navy to tell the exact position, and that's going to be a constant cost factor for their economy. And the Mermaid also comes with decent anti-torpedo, so this is a good boat as well. You should not spam it, but having it in your composition is going to be useful. Time to rank each faction's T2 navy as a whole. Giebmasse likes to provide a differentiated picture, so he says Cyber has stealth and can be versatile. UEF has to micromanage the unit composition very carefully and scout a lot. I completely agree, this is a very important tip. Aeon can be weak in small numbers and get out microed. And Seraphim is good when it's microed against navy that can be dodged. I like it simple and stupid, so I'm just going to provide my ranking. I'd say Cyber is best, followed by Aeon, followed by Seraphim, followed by UEF. T3 Navy is something you don't commonly see because most games end in the T2 Navy stage. So let's just go through it very quickly and start with the battleships. The Aeon battleship is short range and high damage, and you can get it at a medium cost. The Cyber battleship is medium range, it has a fast fire cycle, and you can get it at a low cost. The UEF battleship is high range and high alpha damage, and you get it at a high cost. And the Seraphim battleship is similar to the Cyber battleship, so it's also medium range. It also has a fast fire cycle, but instead of at a low cost, you get it at a medium cost. In exchange, it has an onboard nuke launcher. The unique T3 naval units are pretty hard to compare because they have fairly different roles, but it is still important to look at them for evaluating T3 Navy as a whole. The Aeon missile ship is for bombarding bases. This unit makes up for the short range of the Aeon battleship. Other factions can use their battleship, however, or they have a missile cruiser in the T2 stage for bombarding bases. So the Aeon T3 missile ship has a place in the Aeon military, but this unit also shows that Aeon is slow at capitalizing on one navy. The UEF Neptune Battlecruiser can be a rush unit. If you manage to get T3 Navy way sooner than your opponent, then this unit can win Navy. But also in the T3 stage, it has its place because it can protect your battleships against anything smaller than a battleship. And the Seraphim Submarine Hunter and the Hover Shield form a strong combination, but they also require a good micro. Aircraft carriers are used to replace cruisers in the T3 stage for the purpose of anti-air. Cruisers and carriers have similarly good anti-air, but carriers have way more HP than cruisers. So if you invest a fixed amount of mass into carriers instead of cruisers, you're going to get 3.5 to 4 times more HP for this same mass investment. If you just look at the anti-air weapon itself, Aeon has the best carrier because of its fast projectile speed and because the shots don't miss. The projectiles of the Siren and the Seraphim carrier miss sometimes, but even those weapons are still very good. Of course, you can also use carriers for the purpose of building aircraft, and then your carrier is going to have 50% more build power than your T3 Air HQ. and you can conceal your air force inside the carrier. The Seraphim carrier comes with a mobile missile launcher on board, and this one is the same as the Seraphim cruiser. So a very nice add-on for Seraphim. T3 nuke submarines are available to Aeon, Siren and UEF. These units build and fire naval nukes. They also come with onboard TML. The tactic missile launcher is going to construct tactic missiles for free, and each of those missiles is going to deal 2000 damage. Typically, you fire at mass extractors, but sometimes you are lucky enough to identify an enemy anti-nuke that is not shielded or protected by TMD. Some people just forget to build TMD when they are playing against Siren Navy, because the only Siren naval unit that has onboard TML is the Siren Nuke sub, and you don't see it a lot. The Siren Nuke submarine also comes with onboard stealth and onboard torpedoes. In exchange, the Siren player has to pay a little more to get their nuke submarine, compared to Aeon and UEF. But please don't use the Siren Nuke submarine in close combat, because it is too valuable for that. Seraphim players don't have access to nuke submarines. Instead, they have submarine hunters, and their nuke launcher is on their battleship. The last T3 unit we haven't talked about yet is the sonar. All T3 sonars are mobile, so you can move them. They're not stationary anymore, as opposed to T2 sonars. And each sonar has a special ability. The Aeon sonar has anti-torpedo that grants some extra survivability against submarines until it's in the safe waters again. The Siren sonar has a very large stealth field that is extremely useful. And the UEF sonar has torpedo. The UEF sonar's torpedo has the same range as a T2 submarine and the same damage and fire cycle as a T1 submarine. So it is not bad at all, actually. Seraphim don't have a T3 sonar. Instead, they have a T2 sonar whose range is in between the other faction's T2 sonar and the T3 sonar. So Seraphim players are going to spend less on a higher range for their T2 sonar, but they also don't have the same survivability as a mobile T3 sonar would grant. We are done discussing each T3 unit one by one. It is time to rank each faction's T3 navy as a whole. First is UEF because of the Neptune. This unit had the potential to end the game right away, but even if it doesn't, it at least buys time for the strong battleship to come out. This is followed by Siren because of their inexpensive and quickly firing battleship. Next would be Seraphim because of their nuke battleship and because the combination of submarine hunters and hover shields can be strong with good micro. And last is Aeon because the battleship only has a short range and Aeon players require torrents to bombard bases. So, to summarize, which faction has the best navy? I would say Siren has the best rush navy, UEF has the best late game navy, Seraphim has an overall solid navy, and Aeon has a weak early game navy and difficulties to capitalize on naval victory if it happens. I hope this video answered your questions. If not, please ask in the comments. Some of you may wonder, why is there no T4 on this chart? Well, that's because the Aeon T4 battleship is not cost efficient, the Megalith is too slow, and the Atlantis dies to ground fire all the time. There is no usable T4 navy. Thanks again to Giebmasse and Yudi, and good luck and fun in your games, everyone. If you liked this video, please share it with your friends. And if you did not like this video, please share it with people you hate. Thank you very much and happy cleansing.